Women want think pieces on like the mind state of a woman who like cheated on her husband, but her husband forgave her, and now she still thinks about the guy she cheated with, and she tells her husband about that, and they've gotten into a kind of pseudo like cuckold dynamic where the husband knows she's thinking about the guy she cheated with while the husband rails her. Thank you, women's media. What? I remember that was a thing. I'm like pulling from the cavity of my memory, but that was at one point a think piece. I saw people get mad about it. Isn't that just rage bait? Yeah, it's low rent. It's like, oh, what do women want? Well, women want rage bait for incels, I guess. In my opinion, I think what women want is shopping. Which we should focus on that, maybe. Can you find it and read it? No. How do you square that with the man v bear thing? I have no idea how this at all disagrees with the man v bear theorem. It completely conforms to the man v bear theorem. Yeah, feminist media outlets were always a self-caricature built on rage bait to attract attention. Whereas like anti-female, pro-male spaces like Gamergate or Andrew Tate or whatever have always had a more holistic political project in mind. Also, the problem is that like they're also not opposites. Like, feminism is supposed to be about equality. I mean, it is about equality, right? Whereas the Gamergate, Andrew Tate, such and such is about hating women. You can build the opposite. You can build a space that's about hating men, but it will always be anemic and politically ineffective because there just isn't like there isn't a real weight behind that, and it's not a project worth pursuing anyway. And if you're going to pursue something with an egalitarian agenda, you have to do so, you know, you can't be doing it with the stupid rage bait incel, whatever the... Man v Bear was totally rage bait, though, or at least it had that effect. Nah, I think there was a way more... Nah, I think that was substantial. Like, first of all, it wasn't a media campaign. It was like a random TikTok that blew up. Kind of different from, like, published articles. Second of all, I think that there was a lot more meat with those potatoes. It wasn't just like an empty such and such that was just meant to make people mad. I think that led to some very deliberate conversations. Which I stand by. I mean, I'm fully, you know, I'm with it. I'm hip.
Good hand washing technique. Could be a surgeon. I don't know yet. Oh.
And your blood. Your countrymen are...
Big news, the World Liberty Financial Token Sale is now live. Crypto is the future. Let's embrace this incredible technology and lead the world in digital economy. Go to worldlibertyfinancial.com. Big news, the World Liberty Financial Token Sale is now live.
That's great. Speaking of Donald Trump, like, we know that he's been in mental decline for a while. Has anyone else noticed that during a bunch of his recent rallies, he's kind of, like, sundowned a little bit? What is this?
Well, sir, do you want to play your song and then greet a few people, or do you want to... Well, you had said you wanted to close with a specific song.
I can't do the music because it's copyright. But apparently he just stood here for, like, forever. How, 38 minutes? 38 minutes he just stood here doing this? Trump was actually shortly escorted off stage because he shit himself. A lot of people make that joke. I saw a clip recently that genuinely, to me, looked like he shit himself. He's still... He's just standing here, but I mean, this is just like little clips of it, but... It's haunting. This is like a live rally. Everyone's just sitting there quietly while he rotates, while he gyrates slowly. There's an article about it. Trump's bizarre music session reignites questions about his mental acuity. Sometimes he's with people, sometimes he's not. This is the full stream.
Remember with the purple background, the pink and...
I don't know. Majority Report covered it. Majority Report covers everything. I do genuinely think that he's mentally gone. I think he has been to varying extents for a while, like even in the first presidency. A president is always kind of like a mouthpiece for a bunch of different like voices and forces and influences. I think that at this point, though, he's basically being led around by his handlers. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't, like, he you know, I genuinely don't think that he has much agency at this point. New York Times sane washing his mental breakdown? Well, of course, it's the New York Times. Wow, this is pretty bad, though. And so Mr. Trump, a political candidate known for improvisational departures, made a detour. Rather than try to restart the political program, he seemed to decide in the moment that it would be more enjoyable for all concerned, and it appeared for himself to just listen to music instead. Mr. Trump had his staff fire up his campaign playlist, standing on the stage for about half an hour and swaying to songs as his crowd slowly dwindled. If I ever, like, shit myself in public, I hope the New York Times breaks the story. You know? And so Vosh, you know, a pundit known for improvisational departures, made a detour from the evening's expected plans. He thought it would be more entertaining for all concerned, perhaps including himself, if he would flood his underpants with diarrhea. I'm sorry. It's not me. It's just it's the news. If you read the article, it touches how during the crazy dance party shit, multiple audience members had medical emergencies and had to be carried away on stretchers while he kept dancing without stopping. Still not gonna wash the dinner. 2 rallygoers had medical issues. Rather than continue after paramedics assisting the 2 people, Trump instructed his staff to just play music from a playlist he has personally curated and famously often turns on during dinner at Mar-a-Lago. Who the hell wants to hear questions? Trump said at the event where the entire point was to take audience questions. Right? What followed was more than 30 minutes of Trump swaying on stage and occasionally doing his well-known two-handed dance, that's the double hand job one, to some of his favorite tunes, talking with Kristi Noem, occasionally interacting with attendees who were seated behind the stage. This is the weirdest church service I've ever been to, a first-time rally-goer who did not give their name told NBC News of the music portion of the event, which opened with Ave Maria, which we heard. I loved it, said Jay Bauer, who was in attendance from Montgomery County. I felt like I was sitting in a room with him, just him. Cult, it's a cult. I could have been here another hour, another 2 hours. I could have smelled the shit that he flooded his pants with for hours longer. It would not have mattered to me. Bauer's wife, Janice Bauer, said she expected him to take more questions, but her opinion of Trump has not changed. The concert was great. I guess that's what you're gonna... Yeah, they would have eaten this shit. For sure. Isn't it crazy how Democrats haven't been screaming from the rooftops that Trump is 78 years old and obviously mentally enfeebled? It's almost like they want to lose. Who could have predicted that? I mean, Harris did release her medical history a few days ago, and Trump won't, because of course he won't. I mean, he didn't even release his tax records. In his social media post overnight, Trump called Harris's request for him to release his medical records desperate. She's dying to see my cholesterol, which is 180. I have already provided them many times, including quite recently, and they were flawless. Spectacular. Dems have been saying that, though? Not enough. Not enough. Did you see Trump mispronounce Arizonans? I did see that. It is wild. Did you... Has everyone heard that? This one's pretty crazy. This one's big even for me. As a powerful misspeaker myself.
Thank you, Tanya. Oh, beautiful. You look great. Thank you, darling. Also, we have many Azerasians in our room.
That one's crazy. I have no idea how he got from A to B on that one. That how he got from A to B on that one. Powerful misspeaker myself.
Thank you.
All this spectacular. Dems have been saying that though. Not enough. Not enough. Did you see Trump mispronounce Arizonans? I did see that. It is wild. Did you... Has everyone heard that? This one's pretty crazy. This one's big even for me. As a powerful misspeaker myself.
Thank you, Tanya. Oh, beautiful. You look great. Thank you, darling. Also, we have many Azerasians in our room.
That one's crazy. I have no idea how he got from A to B on that one. That was something else. Asian American? No, he was saying Arizonans. It's like he misread what was on the teleprompter, I guess.
You look great. Thank you, darling. Also, we have many Azerasians.
I love it. I love it. He legit has dementia. I don't know whether it's dementia or whatever, you know, it's I'm not getting into the technicalities. He's got brain soup disease is the issue. I mean, that doesn't really matter that much if you're a president, because there's a million people ready to meaningfully take over the reins, you know, if you're falling apart.
Everyone hold hands.
It's just that,
Sharing my knowledge.
I mean, it's no surprise he doesn't want to debate Kamala Harris again. I'll say that. What would happen if Trump died of old age within the next 3 weeks? You know what else is evidence of sundowning? Whatever mental state it takes to ask me questions that are to the effect of, like, would you like to do alternate history fiction for a bit? Can you predict the future, but, like, specifically?
I'll approve you.
Do you see a crystal ball? You know what'll happen if Trump dies within the next 3 weeks? I'm gonna get some very, very high numbers on my streams for a little while. I'll tell you that much. That's like a solid month of channel-defining content right there. The donations, the views, it's going to be spectacular. Just one of many reasons why it would be a good timeline, you know? Yeah, but it'd be fun to watch him try, nuts. People were talking about this. The expected outcome. Georgia judge says county election officials cannot delay or decline certification of election results. This is probably going to get challenged by, like, the state Supreme Court, you know, however much time we have left. Robert McBurney coming out hard for the woke judge, yeah, coming out hard for Marxism yet again. Did we win? Well, I knew he would do that. We all knew he would do this because of his... I mean, he signaled he was going to do this, but... Are we winning, son? I don't know.
Over 1,000 feet below the height of the surrounding terrain, in clouds and with no clue that they're heading...
If you're not sure what to do next, how about I take you on a walk?
What if Kamala Harris wins? Before the 2020 presidential election, I put out 2 videos. One, me predicting what would happen if Trump won, and one, what I thought would happen if Biden wins. And you know, people ask me this all the time, right? Like, it's like the main thing I get asked is like, well, what do I do, or what should I be concerned about, or whatever the hell. Let's presuppose everything else, all the information. If you watch my content, then you know I think you should vote for Kamala Harris. Should you feel good about it? Probably not, but it has to happen. It has to be done. Better she win than Trump. So let's say she does win. What do we expect going forward from there? You know, people often ask me, because I want you to be in my shoes for a moment, if possible. And I'm going to repeat this bit for the Trump section as well. I get a lot of emails from people who are basically like, I'm on the brink, I'm having a breakdown, I feel like the country is doomed, what do I do? And I think, like, as much as that mental state is conducive to being recruited for, like, alt-right forums, like, that's good for the evil people who kind of like their political constituency being desperate and unstable, I would rather you people feel good for the most part. Like, don't get me wrong, you're all annoying, and I think that you should be mildly punished for that, but not to that extent, not to that, you know, not in that state. So I want to assuage people's concerns a little bit, or maybe exacerbate them. Let's talk about it. If Kamala Harris wins, obviously Donald Trump and Republicans are going to contest the election. In all likelihood, whether or not they succeed in contesting the election, whether or not they succeed in having their version of reality overwritten on top of real reality, that'll depend on the margins by which Kamala Harris wins. I don't think there's any reality in which Kamala Harris wins decisively and then Trump weaponizes the Pentagon or whatever. I think that it would need to be very marginal. January 6th was, for the most part, bad for Republicans. It didn't end up amounting to much because liberals are cowards and they didn't use it as a pretext for cracking down on openly seditious behavior. But January 6th didn't, like, win Republicans much, you know? Even if they had managed to do what they wanted to do, which is break in and fully stop the proceedings with regards to confirming the elector count, and even if they had killed some officials, honestly, if they had killed some officials on January 6th, it might have led to that crackdown from the liberals. So it's possible that they got off easy by not succeeding as much as the mob wanted to. To that end, a second January 6th, a January 7th, one might say, would in all likelihood not be successful in overturning the results of the election. So unless the difference in the victory is very marginal, I don't think there's much they could do. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't be blanketed nonstop with propaganda about how Trump actually won again forever, like probably for the rest of your lives. How bad things get from that point forward is mostly dependent on whether or not Republicans have a backup plan, a contingency for if Trump loses. Because Trump is probably not going to be able to run in 2028. I just don't think it's likely. He is really old and mentally not all there. So the Republicans and the powers that be that back them, largely capital interests, the bourgeoisie, maybe you've heard of this guy called Marx, he was pretty smart, they need to have a backup plan to how do I put this? We live in a flawed democracy, but it is a democracy nonetheless. In order for the powers that be to win through Trump, they need to capture the public vote, or at least enough of it that they can get Trump into the White House and do what they're looking to do. I think that Trump is the only guy who can really, you know, square that circle, who can really walk that tightrope, because he's very uniquely popular with Republican voters, with that constituency. I don't think there is anyone else in the Republican Party right now who could possibly get the vote count that Donald Trump can. And to that end, it makes me wonder, would Republicans and the powers that be that back them, the capital interests, so on and so forth, would they resort to more violent tactics for securing power if Kamala Harris won? Because they can't rely on, like, an electoral strategy again. I don't really know. It seems unlikely to me that they would succeed, because I don't think the Pentagon would necessarily go for that. The question I'm really answering here is, like, what threat is there to your safety? Because that's what people email me about, right? In practice, I think that if Kamala Harris wins, it would be a delaying tactic on our part. It wouldn't solve the problem of MAGA, of fascism, of the creeping encroachment of these forces. This country is not the only country where fascists are gaining power. Canada is almost certainly going to go far right in 2025. Year after year in the European Union, country after country falls to their far-right party. Macron is losing ground. The Labour Party is losing ground. They only gained ground in their most recent elections because the Tories were so wildly unpopular. But if you factor in the Reform Party, they've actually lost ground since before. Like in Italy, in Germany, like time and time again, we're seeing this is a global wave. It is getting worse. If Kamala Harris wins over here in America, we buy 4 years. But for what? What do we get with those 4 years? The tide of fascism is, in large part, a consequence of the liberal Western majority's inability to respond to populist antagonism in the face of problems that are specific to this moment in time, right? Rising cost of housing, globalized markets, the gig economy, an unstable work environment. In an environment like this, people want answers. They want politicians who seem like they understand their problems, and liberals are bad at pretending to meet those needs. Because liberals are, generally speaking, institutionally inclined. They believe in the system, they trust the system, they want to shore up the system. So if you fundamentally doubt or question or challenge the system, if you think that the system isn't something that should be mildly fixed, not something that should be reformed, but rather something that should be fundamentally challenged, that there's something fundamentally wrong with it, liberals don't have good answers for you. This is the problem we keep seeing. We're seeing it right now with Trudeau losing ground, Macron losing ground, in France, Germany with the AFD. Time and time again, this is the pattern that crops up. So what do we get here in America? Maybe Donald Trump, who will probably not be able to run in 2028, maybe he's the only guy who can get the votes necessary for the Republicans to win. But what do we do in the global context of this rising wave? I think, unfortunately, that even if Kamala Harris wins, we're only setting up for a greater problem in the future.
Thank you for
There are so many ways that the problems that are, rising up abroad can affect us. An economic crisis, China invading Taiwan, Russia cutting off energy to Europe, trade wars between us and other countries. There are a million things that could happen that could press further and further into this tension, this antagonism that we feel both with our neighbors locally and globally, that might incline people towards populist solutions. And if liberals aren't willing to give answers that are satisfactory to populist inclined individuals, the fascists will. This is one of the reasons why there is a small but not ideologically insubstantial overlap between people who were wooed by Bernie Sanders and people who were wooed by Trump. Now, I don't think people went from Bernie to Trump. I think a lot of people who were already pro-Trump were sympathetic to Bernie because they saw in Bernie an element of the populism that they see in Donald Trump. I think that even that relation between Trump and Bernie is wildly inaccurate, but keep in mind I'm talking about people who like Trump here. They're not that bright. They see the populist element. If liberals can't do anything about it, if liberals can't build off that platform or speak to it or build support off of people's anxieties in a way more convincing than Obama or Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris being fundamentally institutionalist, the fascists are going to keep gaining ground. It's a dynamic, it's a point in the dialectic that is advancing right now that we haven't seen the other side of, right? There's like a dozen countries in the West that are having this exact pattern play out right now, and not one of them has crossed over to the other side, where the fascist populists gain power, burn themselves out, collapse, and then a new order is established, right? Like the dialectic is mounting, we're reaching a crescendo, but without knowing what's on the other side of it, we can't really make predictions about what's going to happen here. And I'm not a historical fatalist, I'm not a materialist in that sense. I don't think that we're guaranteed to follow down that path. I don't think that it's like predestined. A lot of stuff can happen. The world can end. I don't know. It is a great unknown. And it is, I think, rather frightening. I think that it would be disingenuous of me to not say that it's frightening. Kamala Harris wins, and what, 4 years pass under Kamala Harris, not much changes, and we see like 3, 4, 5, 6 more countries that were liberal democracies cede more and more ground to the right. Maybe that doesn't lead to much, right? Maybe in Italy and France and Canada and Germany and so on, the fascists take power, but then they are incompetent, they are bitterly divided, they infight, and inevitably people get sick of them, and they, you know, toss them out and the liberal order is reestablished, or God willing, maybe something better than the liberal order. I mean, pardon me for, you know, wouldn't that be nice? That you could imagine, like, well, maybe there's a not fascist or liberal option. That would be nice, I think. If you've heard about it, the point that I'm getting at here is that I think that we have a lot of work to do if Kamala Harris wins, and I think that work is very frightening because a lot of it is going to have to be waged against an uncertain enemy. Is the enemy, like, in a broad sense, the capital class, the bourgeoisie? Sure, fine, yeah, like in a broad, abstracted sense. In an immediate sense, what we're actually talking about is like a global wave of fascism, antagonistic forces, internal and foreign. You know, I mean, like Russia and China have heavy backing with right-wing movements, both in the West and like within their own countries. You know, the capital class is not unified necessarily. There are wealthy people and there are businesses that are at least building a facsimile of liberal or progressive political affiliation, right? Like it's not simple. is what I'm saying. It'll be complicated. And for the fascist, the job is quite easy. It is very easy to destabilize a structure. It's very easy to break an institution. You poke at it and hit it with like rocks and hammers and stuff. And from our perspective, we're talking about like a simultaneous process of critique and construction where we're trying to build something that is widely reviled by the powers that be, right? Like any kind of meaningful progressive or socialist project, even an incrementalist one, is going to immediately make itself a target to a great many people, liberal or fascist. And what we seek to critique is so nebulous and vague that it might be difficult, like even electorally, to get people to understand what we're talking about. What is this global wave of fascism? How do you point at the world, you point around and you say, well, like, okay, what patterns are making all of these liberal democracies crumble and allowing the global far right to take hold of them? Like, what is it? It's not like a disease or a technology or anything coherent and fundamental like that. It's something abstract. It's something, you know, Marx wrote about this, all right? If only somebody had ever read anything that he wrote. I certainly haven't. That's what I think we're getting if Kamala Harris wins. I think it's going to be a very frustrated process. I don't know why you're all asking me questions. I'm ignoring all of you. I think it's going to be a very frustrating process. I think that the Democrats are probably going to be very ineffective and abstemious in challenging reactionary legislation in red states. Like, for example, I would be very surprised if Kamala Harris has the will politically or the ability to deal with problems like Texas's abortion ban, for example, or the myriad like book bans or anti-transgender legislation that have cropped up in red states. I think red states will continue to be a bastion for reactionary thought and for harm against marginalized people. Part of that's not even Kamala Harris's fault, because remember, the Supreme Court's still going to be like Republican oriented, and in all likelihood nothing will be able to go through Congress, so you're kind of limited to like executive action and a few bipartisan you know, spending bills or something to that effect. Not the cheeriest outcome if we win here. On the plus side, though, I really do think that it will functionally be the end of Donald Trump's, like, potential as a political force, in an electoral sense, at least. Like, he'll continue to go on TV and call into Fox News and stuff like that. And without that, like, leadership, I do think that the right wing will deflate for a time while they search for a new leader, basically. It's not going to be J.D. Vance. It's not going to be, you know, Ron DeSantis. It's not going to be Ted Cruz. I don't know who has the sauce. It seems like all the people in the GOP who have any sauce do so by riding the coattails of Donald Trump. Will Elon Musk have the sauce? He's so uncharismatic, man. Vivek riding Donald Trump's coattails. You know, I don't know who could really like take up that crown. So maybe it gives us a little bit of breathing room. Maybe economic and environmental circumstances allow for a kind of global deflation of this rising tide of the far right, which would give us more breathing room here in this country. That would be nice. You know, I think that would be nice. I think that'd be pretty cool. I think it'd be PogChamp. So that's my thought, and if Kamala Harris wins. Oh, and if Kamala Harris wins, she's not going to do shit about Netanyahu. I'm sorry. Maybe she, like, is marginally better than Joe Biden. The Israel situation is going to burn out on its, like, Israel is on a like a collision course right now with self-destruction, just because it is engaged in like unsustainable levels of evil. You know, you can only go at it for so long and with so much force. So, you know, eventually that situation's going to solve itself just through like inertia. I mean, a lot of people are going to die on the way. It would be nice if we had a president with the stones to stand up to Netanyahu, but of course the only alternative to Kamala Harris, who probably won't have the stones, is Donald Trump, who has the stones to fully back Netanyahu in a way that even Joe Biden has not thus far been willing to do. So that's what you get, I guess. That's, you know, we live to suffer.
This is Pamela Ray Schuler. She's a stand-up comedian, and we're about to watch stand-up that's medically relevant, and she's gonna explain it to you, and I'm gonna explain the jokes. Let's get started.
I am fully medicated now. Anybody else? Antidepressants? Medication? Yeah.
I don't know how I feel when comedians make that joke.
Why?
You shouldn't ever be upset that you're taking a medicine, but celebrating that you're taking?
No, it normalizes it. How
But-
many people are gonna see this and be like, oh my gosh, I don't need to be ashamed?
Yes, but then how many people are gonna request medicines that they don't yet need?
And then it's up to people like you,
That's true. That's a lot of weight on my shoulders.
doctors.
Well, no, it points to the fine line between breaking the stigma and not spreading misinformation.
Or celebrating who she is and what she's going through.
I'm not anything against celebration.
I thought I was on an antidepressant. It turns out I'm not. It turns out I'm actually on a mood stabilizer that they use as an antidepressant. Fun fact about prescription drugs. Everything they prescribe, they actually use for like 4 different things.
That's true, and not only do we use it for 4 different things, some don't even have an FDA approval for those things. Like they haven't been adequately studied, so we use them off-label.
I know that because I've been on so many meds for Tourette's that are not for Tourette's because a study showed that it might help Tourette's. When I was 12, I wore the nicotine patch because there was a study.
Did it help?
No, it just made me Jones.
Okay. Well, we had to try something. You're out of control otherwise.
So you don't really know what your deal is until you find a combo that works and then Google all your pills by yourself. So after years of trial and error, I finally found a combination of things that worked for me.
I don't want people to try it on themselves.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these medications have really bad interactions. So you have to have a thorough knowledge of how they interact with each other. Like if a patient of mine is on 3 psychoactive medications, I get them a psychiatrist ASAP.
Okay, that's smart.
Because it's just, there's so many interactions that I'm not well versed enough to know how, to have the experience to know how they.
That's important.
What if Kamala...
Over 1,000 feet below the height of the surrounding terrain, in clouds and with no clue that they're heading straight towards a mountain.
Terrain ahead.
Stay tuned. Have you ever heard the phrase rubbish in, rubbish out? Well, this refers to when you enter something faulty into a computer, which then causes you to get something equally faulty back. And in the world of aviation, with its ever more complicated computer systems, this holds a special significance. Back in 1995, one of the deadliest disasters involving a US carrier took place when the crew of American Airlines Flight 965 failed to spot that they had programmed the wrong waypoint into their flight management computer. This was a single innocuous error, but one that led the aircraft onto a track towards high terrain without the pilots even noticing it. Until it was too late. Now, the aviation industry learned a very hard lesson on that day. So after that, strict confirmations of waypoints and computer inputs have been drilled into all pilots. So that should mean that a similar accident shouldn't be possible today, right? Well, this brings us to today's story, which took place on the 10th of November 2016. This day was supposed to have been a standby duty for the two involved pilots, but late in the afternoon on the 9th of November, the Wizz Air operations controller had called them up and informed them that they would need to operate 4 flights in the following day. The first of those flights was going to be a positioning or ferry flight from Budapest in Hungary over to Nice in Serbia. And these kinds of ferry flights are occasionally required when an aircraft needs to be brought from one airport to another for technical or operational reasons. What it means is that basically the pilots would position the aircraft themselves and sometimes their cabin crew without any passengers, and this can often lead to a more relaxed atmosphere on board. So when the pilots eventually turned up to their crew room in Budapest on the 13th of November, they likely looked forward to this first flight. It's always fun to do something slightly different. Now, neither of them had flown to Nice airport before, so when they started going through the pre-flight material, they probably looked a bit closer at the arrival and approach charts to try to figure out what they could expect, as well as, of course, the overall weather and note times. But everything looked reasonably straightforward. So when they were happy with the preparation, they just went over to brief their 4 cabin crew colleagues who were likely also looking forward to a very relaxed start of their day. Now, as they all walked out to the aircraft, a shiny Airbus A320-200, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for this first ferry flight leg, and the captain would therefore be pilot monitoring. But this makes sense to me, as they were flying to a new destination, and when you're a captain, it's always nice to do that as pilot monitoring, because that gives a better overview of the general operation and enables you to spot any potential issues early and then plan for them. Or at least that's the idea. Now, there might of course be situations where the captain have to be pilot flying, especially if the runway is short or there are other operational limitations, but this was not the case here, even though the approach looked a little bit tricky. When they entered the cockpit, the captain first checked the technical status of the aircraft, which was perfectly fine. There was no technical issues open. So he quickly then went outside to start to walk around while the first officer started setting up the cockpit. As he was doing so, one of the flight attendants asked if she could stay in the cockpit for the flight, and the pilot agreed, or maybe it was the other way around, and it was the pilot who asked. We don't even know for sure. But this is not unusual on positioning flights, since it gives the cabin crew an opportunity to both enjoy the views from the flight deck, but also to get a better understanding of the workload that the pilots are facing during different phases of flight, something that is otherwise pretty hidden nowadays behind the locked cockpit door. For us pilots, it's also nice to get a chance to talk to our cabin crew colleagues a bit, something short-haul pilots rarely get a chance to do nowadays, but it can also create an environment which can become a little bit too relaxed and therefore lead to distractions if it's not managed well. So, who were the pilots on this flight then? Well, the captain was 62 years old and very experienced. He had flown over 22,000 hours in total, with nearly 5,500 of those on the Airbus A320 family. On this day, he said that he felt all right, but that he had not gotten much quality sleep during the previous night, so he also felt a little bit tired. His co-pilot was 49 years old and also relatively experienced, with nearly 5,000 hours of total time and just over 2,000 hours on the Airbus A320 and 321. He had just returned back from some annual leave and had therefore not flown at all during the preceding 10 days. But he was feeling great, and maybe that fact, the fact that he was feeling rested, was another reason for him to fly the first leg. In any case, the pilots continued to set up the aircraft according to their standard procedures. First officer completed the departure briefing, and after that they would have briefed their cabin crew colleague on how to use the jump seat, headset and oxygen mask, something that we have to do every time we have someone traveling on the jump seat. After everyone was ready, the first officer asked for pushback and startup clearance, and once that was received, Wizz Air Flight 801 pushed back, started its engines and was soon on its way out towards the runway. Everything was running smoothly as the aircraft continued to taxi out, and they had soon lined up on the runway and received their takeoff clearance. The first officer then set takeoff thrust, the aircraft started accelerating and proceeded for a normal takeoff. They were now on their way towards Nice, climbing like a rocket due to the aircraft's low weight without passengers. And before we go any further, it's worth explaining a little bit more about the destination that these pilots were now flying towards. Nice, Constantine the Great Airport, is the second largest airport in Serbia. It's situated in the southern part of the country near the Stara Planina, or Old Mountains, which form part of the western end of the Balkan mountain range, right on the border between Serbia and Bulgaria. And that is one of the biggest threats at Nice, the very high terrain surrounding the airport, as it's actually situated in kind of a valley. While the elevation of the runway is only 650 feet, it is surrounded on nearly all sides by very high terrain, with minimum sector altitude, MSAs, reaching as high as 7,000 feet. The MSAs is altitudinal charge, and they always gives a minimum terrain clearance of 1,000 feet, and it's one of those things that we pilots have to be constantly aware of. Now, if you're on an instrument flight plan, which all big aircraft are, you can of course descend below the MSA, but only if you're following a pre-approved track or procedure. And the high terrain around this airport meant that accurate track keeping was really important. Because of this, all the arrivals, approach and missed approach procedures into Nice were planned with strict altitude constraints, and that's worth keeping in mind. Now, the risk of flying into mountains might not be a very high concern for you, but something that I definitely think should be is the risk of your personal data being bought and sold for malicious use. You might not realize it, but every day your personal information like your name, home, email address and even your browsing habits are being auctioned out online by companies known as data brokers, and that's actually what's causing most spam emails, robocalls and phishing attempts. This is completely legal, believe it or not, but that also means that you have the right to opt out of it. The problem is that it's a royal pain to contact all of these brokers individually and then stay on top of them, so this is where today's sponsor Incogni comes in. Once you have signed up with Incogni, they will take care of all of this for you, so you can just sit back, relax and look at their dashboard as the digital army starts chasing these companies down. When I first signed up, I was really stunned by just the sheer number of companies that were selling my data, and so far Incogni have already sent out over 110 requests and completed 94 takedowns. Awesome. So if you want to take back control of your personal data, then give Incogni a try by clicking on my special link here below, which is incogni.com/pilot. If you do that and then use the code PILOT, you'll get a whopping 60% discount off their annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now, let's continue. Remember, I was just talking about the importance of keeping track of all minimum en route altitudes when we're flying. Another thing that will become really important soon is a system that you might have heard me talking about in some of my other videos, the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, or EGPWS. This system is super clever and likely one of the most safety-enhancing things that have been fitted to aircraft lately. It utilizes a database called WGS84 along with input from the Global Positioning System to make sure it always knows exactly where the aircraft is in relation to surrounding terrain, obstacles and man-made structures. It can provide a range of warnings and cautions to crew in order to alert them if, for example, the aircraft is too close to having the landing gear in the incorrect position, or if the flap configuration is not correctly set. It can also do the same if the aircraft fails to achieve a positive climb after takeoff, or if its sink rate and approach is too high. In addition to alerts, the EGPWS system can also provide terrain information, which can be selected to overlay the navigation display and show a kind of picture of the terrain around the aircraft. In that setting, it color coordinates terrain to show anything below the aircraft as green, or which is really far below, black, anything between the same level to 1,000 feet above as low-density yellow blocks, anything above that as high-density yellow, and terrain more than 2,000 feet above as red. Now the pilots must choose between showing either the weather radar or terrain display, since both can't be shown on the same screen simultaneously, and when operating in areas with high terrain, like this airport in this case, it's generally a good idea for one pilot to have terrain display than for the other to have the weather radar. Now Airbus uses a Honeywell EGPWS, which contains 6 different modes which are worth knowing about. The first 5 modes provide cautions and warnings for excessive descent rate, excessive terrain closure rate, altitude loss after takeoff or go-around, unsafe terrain clearance when not in landing configuration, and excessive deviation below the glide slope. And the sixth mode just provides advisory callouts like bank angle and minimums. But the one that will become really interesting in this story is mode number 2, excessive terrain closure rate. This mode includes cautions like
Terrain.
which changes to
Pull up.
warnings if the aircraft comes within the warning range. And here comes a difference between the old GPWS, which the crew in the Cali accident had, and the enhanced system, which we're talking about here. You see, in the enhanced system, it doesn't just react to terrain, it can also look ahead, effectively predicting a conflict and therefore providing a much greater alerting time. It does this by projecting ribbons ahead of the aircraft, which shows where the aircraft will be during the coming minutes with its current trajectory and speed. It then compares this progress prediction with its terrain database, and if that prediction shows that the ribbons will risk running into terrain, so then it starts issuing an alert. The caution alert typically sounds when the aircraft is predicted to be around 40 to 60 seconds away from impact, and the pull-up warning then sounds approximately 30 seconds before. 30 seconds is still not a lot of time, but because it's based on a forward-looking predictive function, it should be enough if the correct responses are followed. Now, once the aircraft had reached its cruising altitude, the crew relaxed a bit. They then completed their paperwork, and it's fair to assume that the atmosphere on board was quite relaxed and pleasant at this point, possibly with the cockpit door open and with more cabin crew coming in and visiting. But as the aircraft eventually started approaching the top of descent, the crew started to concentrate and prepare for the arrival with the expected terrain threats fresh in their minds. It was particularly important to do a thorough brief here, since neither of the pilots had ever operated into this airport before. Now, without experience of the airport and what clearances traffic control might give them, the crew decided to set up the arrival and approach suggested on their flight plan, the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival. And after having checked the weather, they also saw that runway 11 was in use with a VOR approach. Now, the Airbus A320 has an FMC, a flight management computer, in which the crew can program the route, also things like the expected arrival and approach procedure. So the crew here just selected the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival and then added the VOR 11 approach from the approach drop-down menu. The FMC also gives an option of selecting a transition or via point. And for the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha, the November India Sierra navade was the final point before transitioning into the procedural VOR approach, so they likely would have selected this as well. Now, when we're using the FMC programmed arrivals and approaches, the Compact Display Unit, or CDU, also shows any relevant speeds and altitude constraints coded into those procedures. For example, in this case, the requirement was to be at or above 4,300 feet until passing Ribar, Lamov, and a navade called Juliet Sierra Tango. And once selected, this information would have also been visible on their navigation displays. Now, when everything was set up, the pilots also spent some time discussing potential threats for the approach, including the fact that the VOR glide path is steeper than usual, which might require them to configure early to get the speed down. And also the fact that this was a non-precision approach, which always requires higher concentration, diligence, and adherence to procedures. Now, including potential threats in the briefing is a relatively recent concept, because it's been found that by visualizing and coming up with strategies for dealing with anticipated threats, many errors can be avoided and crews become generally more resilient. This is similar to you planning for a busy traffic situation and therefore leaving your house earlier for work, but at a much bigger scale. Now, the VOR approach into runway 11 in this case also involved something known as a procedural turn, starting at Vendrilla Sierra VOR and then turning via Lamov to Ribar and to the final approach point at Juliet Sierra Tango. With the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival, the crew would have had to fly this whole procedure, but there was actually a better arrival available for them, which would lead them in a straight line towards Ribar and Juliet Sierra Tango for a straight-in approach. This approach was called SOSEC 2 Alpha, but since the crew were unfamiliar with the airport, they just went with whatever was in their flight plan instead. Now, it is worth pointing out here that there was also a transition from the Juliet Sierra Tango and the beacon on that arrival to allow entrance into the VOR approach from other directions, 12, and that Juliet Sierra Tango transition will soon become important. But the crew likely didn't spend so much time looking at different arrivals, because, like I mentioned before, there was also additional threats with this approach, including the fact that it was steeper than normal, but also that the inbound course on the approach was 115 degrees, but the runway direction was 109 degrees, meaning an offset by 6 degrees. That might not sound like a lot, but it would have meant that the runway would not be directly in front of them when they became visual, and they would therefore also require to do some late-stage maneuvering. So the pilots discussed how they intended to fly all of this, and would have covered elements like how and when they would slow down and configure the aircraft, if the weather was okay for the approach, and what they expected to see once visual. But that brings up the question, what was the weather like? Well, while the conditions on the ground was relatively good, with only light and variable winds, a QNH of 1013 and a temperature of 6 degrees Celsius, higher up the picture was slightly different. There were several layers of clouds at altitude, which would obscure the view of the terrain, so during the descent the crew would be flying almost entirely inside of cloud, preventing any visual orientation at all, and that's also worth keeping in mind. Anyway, the crew soon received clearance from the area controller to start the descent down towards the destination, and soon they also approached Sosek, which was the starting point for their arrival procedure. But when they were almost over that point, the controller suddenly called them up and cleared them to follow the Sosek 2 Alpha arrival instead of the Sosek 1 Romeo Alpha. Now, as I mentioned before, this was actually a better routing for them overall, but it was not the one that they had actually briefed. It isn't uncommon that there are several arrivals starting from the same point and going to the same runway. The reason for that is that the different ones can then be used depending on which nav aids are working or for traffic separation purposes, and if you find yourself having programmed and briefed one arrival and then you are suddenly cleared for another, you can always try to make your life easy by asking the controller if you can fly the one that you've planned for, and they might actually approve that. But if that's not possible, or like in this case it would mean a significantly longer routing, well then it's super important that the pilots enter the new arrival into the flight management computer, checks it thoroughly, and then brief it all over again, since both the routing and the altitude restrictions can be very different. But in this case, the crew seemed to be in a little bit of a hurry, so they just entered the new arrival into the FMC and executed it, without ever going through and briefing it properly. And that's even though they had plenty of time to do so at this point. Now, if they would have looked at it, they would have noticed that the Sosek 2 Alpha would, like I mentioned before, bring the aircraft in on a more direct route via Ribar and then towards the Juliet Sierra Tango MDB for the approach. But do you remember the Juliet Sierra Tango transition that I talked about earlier? And this transition created a procedural turn from Juliet Sierra Tango via a point called Nice B08, Ribar, and then back to Juliet Sierra Tango. But from the direction that flight 801 was now coming, there was no reason to fly them. They were already coming from Ribar directly towards Juliet Sierra Tango and could therefore proceed straight to the approach. But that procedure turn was still in there as an option, and when the pilots just quickly entered this new arrival, reselected the approach via Juliet Sierra Tango, then executed, it stayed in there. If they would have selected the no via option instead, that would have solved the problem. Remember? Rubbish in, rubbish out. Now, the minimum altitude that all aircraft had to maintain until reaching Juliet Sierra Tango was 4,300 feet. This was true both from the direction of Ribar and for the procedure turn after Juliet Sierra Tango if coming from the other direction. The earliest time anyone could descend from 4,300 feet was after passing Juliet Sierra Tango and established on the 115-degree final inbound track towards the UR. And that is going to be very important. The pilots continued to descend according to the minimum altitudes on the arrival, and after they passed Ribar, they should have set 4,300 feet, which was the platform altitude for the Ribar approach. But instead, the first officer now selected 1,000 feet in open descent, which caused the aircraft to start descending below the minimum altitude, way too early. He didn't mention this rule change to the captain, which is a serious breach of procedures, especially when flying in mountainous terrain, but luckily the captain quite quickly realized this error and told him to immediately climb back up to 4,300 feet again. Now we don't know why this mistake happened, but 1,000 feet was the minimum descent altitude in the VR approach, rounded up from 970 feet, and it is possible that the first officer, being a little bit stressed about the coming steep offset approach, simply made a mistake here, and it wouldn't be the last one. This hiccup would have likely increased the workload for the first officer, since the real descent point, Juliet Sierra Tango, was less than 3 nautical miles away when this happened, and this might also have had an impact on what happened next. As the aircraft passed Juliet Sierra Tango, the first officer expected to now finally be able to start descending down towards the airport. There were a lot of other configurations that also needed to be made, and all of this would have formed part of the mental picture he now had for the approach ahead. But here, something completely baffling happened. The aircraft suddenly started turning left. Now, of course, it did so because of the route that was loaded into the flight management computer, but the first officer who was flying did not want that to happen. So he now pulled out the heading track button to take control of the direction manually and keep the aircraft continuing straight ahead. And he also quickly initiated the descent down towards 1,200 feet. The captain, who had caught the earlier altitude mistake the first officer had made, now told him to instead allow the aircraft to complete the full procedure turn. In his view, they had already deviated from the approach radial at this point, so he likely thought that, although annoying, a turn wouldn't be a disaster and they could just start the approach once they reached the NDB again after the turn. But somehow, he missed that the first officer had also started descending. Remember, the minimum altitude was 4,300 feet until passing the Juliet Sierra Tango NDB inbound on the approach, and that was for very good reasons. There were several high mountains in this area, including a peak of 3,152 feet, quite close to the approach track. And instead of allowing the first officer, who was still pilot flying, to take care of the turn, the captain instead intervened and simply turned the heading rod around himself and then re-engaged the lateral navigation. And as he was doing that, the first officer was simultaneously reducing the descent rate from 1,100 feet a minute to 700. I would just like to point out here that it's never a good idea to have both pilots inputting on the flight controls or the mode control panel at any point. It's super important that we keep to our designated areas of responsibility in order to avoid confusion of who is in control. And this is especially true when the first officer is pilot flying, as the captain overriding can cause the first officer to completely lose initiative and situational awareness. So what was now happening was that the two pilots had two completely different views on how to solve their current situation. The captain wanted to complete the turn whilst maintaining 4,300 feet until over the Juliet Sierra Tango again, but the first officer had intended to just manually continue inbound and therefore started to descend. And the result was the worst possible combination of those two plans. At an altitude of only 2,200 feet, the aircraft was on a heading of 158 degrees to rejoin the track towards Juliet Sierra Tango, but that also meant that they now had a huge mountain towering 1,000 feet above and ahead of them. At this point, the captain must have suddenly realized that the aircraft wasn't maintaining its altitude, and he therefore called out, "Why are we descending?" whilst also telling the first officer to immediately go around and start turn left. But by this point, they had descended even further, down to 1,880 feet, and they were now so close to the mountain that the enhanced ground proximity warning system activated and started blaring out,
Terrain ahead. Pull up.
Now when that warning is heard, there is a very clear procedure that must be followed immediately and without hesitation, and that's known as the terrain escape maneuver. In the Airbus, that maneuver includes turning the autopilot off, pitch, pull to full backstick, thrust levers full toga, speed brakes verified down, and bank, wings level or adjust. It's super important that the pilot flying execute these items immediately from memory, and it's the job of the pilot monitoring to make sure that everything is done correctly, monitor the aircraft's performance, and to call out any tendencies towards terrain. But what instead happened here was that as the captain called for the first officer to go around and to climb, the first officer reacted by engaging the autopilot in full climb, even though the autopilot should be immediately disconnected in this case. And after that, both pilots started pulling back on their respective side sticks. But none of them moved the thrust levels into the toga detent, so the thrust just stayed in normal climb as instructed by the autopilot and the auto thrust. Again, following standard procedures and adhering to designated roles would have likely captured these mistakes, but a feeling of panic was now starting to spread, and with that, the communication was also breaking down even further, meaning that the thrust was left unchanged. Now, when two pilots pulled back on their side sticks at the same time without anyone taking priority, the Airbus's fly-by-wire system will take both of those inputs into account. In this case, this meant that the nose of the aircraft rapidly rose to a pitch up of almost 21 degrees. And what happens if the nose attitude is suddenly increased without full thrust selected? Yes, the speed now started washing off at the same time as the angle of attack also started rising. Now, remember how I mentioned the American Airlines Cali accident earlier on and how they had been tricked to fly towards a mountain due to a mistake they had made in their FMC? Well, that's very similar to what had happened here, and now the similarities became almost eerie as this crew also initially mishandled the terrain escape maneuver.
Let's find shelter.
But this is where decades of technical advancements finally came to the pilot's aid. Because not only did this crew get their terrain warning significantly earlier than the crew of American Airlines Flight 965, they also had the awesome protections of the Airbus A320 at their disposal. You see, the Airbus contains numerous protections known as hard protections, and those are non-overridable actions taken by the out-of-flight system to keep the aircraft within a safe flight envelope, and they are available as long as the aircraft is operating in normal law. One of these protections is known as alpha floor, and it kicks in when the speed of the aircraft starts to fall below the minimum selectable airspeed together with a high angle of attack. All of this was happening in this case due to the extremely high pitch angle combined with a turn away from the terrain and a dropping airspeed. When this is sensed, one of the things that happens is that it causes an auto-engagement of maximum toga thrust, and it then locks that thrust in using something known as toga lock. This function will, as the name suggests, keep the thrust output in toga until the crew unlocks it by disengaging the auto throttle. So as these pilots were now pitching up and turning with the speed dropping, the aircraft itself actually gave them full thrust, despite them not initially setting it. Now they did eventually move the thrust levels into the toga detent, but at that stage, toga lock had already engaged and it would have been visible on their FMAs in their primary flight displays. And as we will see, this was soon going to give them a whole new problem. You see, having gone from a potential controlled flight into terrain event, where aside from a loss of situational awareness, the pilot had at least been in control of the aircraft, they now started to really fall behind the airplane, which essentially meant that instead of them flying the airplane was now flying them. Throughout this whole ordeal, the crew had not been in contact with the NIS approach controller. But the last time that he had heard anything from them was when they read back their approach clearance. But now they called him up again, explaining that they had gone around. The controller responded and asked the crew to maintain the go-around altitude of 4,300 feet, but at this stage that altitude was already well below them. Now they overshot that missed approach altitude, likely because of a combination of their very low weight and the fact that they were prioritizing the terrain escape maneuver, which I completely understand. But once they felt sure that the terrain was no longer a factor, the first officer started to lower the nose to try and level off. And what do you think happened then? Yes, since the auto throttle was still in toga lock, it didn't matter that the crew pulled the thrust levels back, the engines would just keep producing maximum thrust until the pilots fully disengaged the auto thrust. And an interesting tidbit here is that toga lock actually would disengage on other Airbus types, but not on the Airbus A320. Anyway, this high thrust now caused the light aircraft to quickly accelerate, and it soon reached an astonishing speed of 331 knots, only 19 knots away from the maximum certified speed of the aircraft. At around 6,500 feet, the pilots finally managed to disengage the auto thrust and get the speed back under control, and around 30 seconds later, they also managed to level off, reaching a maximum altitude of 7,640 feet. 3,340 feet above the cleared altitude and 81 knots faster than the highest speed allowed.
The same very soon after, resulting in significant death tolls and absolutely catastrophic destruction of property. These natural disasters are tragedies, and one could argue that the response from Washington has left a lot to be desired. But as much as one can criticize the American government for a great many things, a conspiracy theory has been circulating that the government manufactured these hurricanes as a deliberate attack on those states, presumably for political purposes. Here's the sort of thing that's been circulating on social media: pushing Helene up the coast with Nexrad, Doppler, misspelled of course, and HARP. We will talk about what those are a little later. They cooked this one up. Who is they? The government? Meteorologists? Perhaps those pesky Jews again? Let's play it safe and blame it on Jewish government meteorologists. Here's the next one. A hurricane as weather warfare. Yes, not a natural disaster. They are pretending it's a weapon used by the government on its own people. And if you want to argue with this person, they will bury you in tax dollars. Sure, I'll take your pile of money, internet weirdo. Surprising absolutely no one, the single dumbest person in the history of American politics, Marjorie Taylor Greene, decided to chime in. Climate change is the new COVID. Well, genius, the novel coronavirus that caused COVID came about in 2019, and we've been talking about climate change for at least 50 years. So that's an insanely stupid thing to say, even just based on raw chronology. But of course also for many other more important reasons, like the fact that they are both real things, and neither of them are government-controlled. But any narrative where politicians can play the victim of the nasty government will be spewed no matter how ridiculous when we are this close to a general election. So this is what's happening on the internet right now. And as a result of this frenzy, meteorologists have been getting actual death threats. Not one of them once, many of them many times. That's how out of hand this has gotten. Alabama meteorologist James Spann has said that he's been inundated with misinformation and threatening messages like "stop lying about the government controlling the weather or else." Other meteorologists, as a result of simply posting a hurricane forecast, get accused of creating the hurricane personally and working for the Illuminati. Social media is infested with people calling for actual violence, saying that the people who created Hurricane Milton should be killed. Here is one such tweet now with a desperate meteorologist shouting into the abyss, only to have someone reflect the insanity right back to her as she can barely even finish her sentence. Her frustration here is palpable. Meanwhile, other people are busy pulling demonstrably false claims right out of their asses. This jerk, Stu Peters, is pretending that Milton had some unprecedented trajectory that somehow proves it's man-made. Hurricanes don't form in the Gulf of Mexico and then hit Florida? Really? This other jerk, Grant Cardone, is doing the same thing. He's been watching these since he was a kid. Fabricated anecdotal evidence is so powerful. In reality, this is totally commonplace. Hurricanes Mindy, Emily, Debbie, and many others all formed in the Gulf and moved due east. There is nothing irregular about this. This data is freely available. These people just assert a blatant falsehood, and it gets amplified by people who don't lift a finger to see if it's true or not. And then the amplified falsehood becomes more influential than actual facts. This is the post-truth era that we live in. The disinformation has gotten so bad that people are rejecting aid from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, whose only purpose is to aid in the recovery from disasters like Hurricane Milton. Social media posts are instructing those ravaged by the storm to resist aid from FEMA, even in the form of armed militias, going so far as encouraging people to shoot FEMA workers. This is absolutely insane. It's like having your house go up in flames, reading on social media that the fire department actually sprayed, even in the form of armed militias, going so far as encouraging people to shoot FEMA workers. This is absolutely insane. It's like having your house go up in flames, reading on social media that the fire department actually sprays gasoline on fires, so you shouldn't let them near you with the hose, and then shooting at firemen when they come to save you from your house fire. In light of all of this, for the next few minutes, we are going to explore how completely idiotic all of these claims are, and we are going to start as simply as possible. What is wind? If you are a person who believes that the government can manufacture hurricanes, but you can't answer the question, what is wind, then you need to accept the fact that you have absolutely no clue what you're talking about, and must therefore listen to me explain to you what wind is. Here we go. The atmosphere is full of molecules. I mean, really full of them. There are about 10 trillion molecules in every cubic meter of air. That adds up to about 10 to the 44 molecules in the entire atmosphere. Most of the atmosphere is diatomic molecules like nitrogen and oxygen, and the rest is carbon dioxide, monoatomic noble gases, water vapor, and some other stuff. Tiny molecules have such little mass that they float around instead of falling to the ground like big things, but they are still subject to gravity, which is why the atmosphere gets thinner and thinner with elevation. How fast do these molecules move? At room temperature, they go around 300 to 400 meters per second, which is around 670 to 890 miles per hour, so pretty fast. In fact, everyone should know that temperature is merely a measure of the average kinetic energy of particles in a system, in this case, atmospheric particles, so citing the outside temperature is simply a way of expressing how fast atmospheric particles are moving. But this movement is not uniform. Particles are not moving around all orderly in single file. This motion is very chaotic. Solar radiation reaches the Earth and excites atmospheric particles, but it does so unevenly and at different rates depending on the nature of the surface being irradiated, whether water, different types of land, and so forth, which reflect a portion of that energy back up to the air again. And of course, the Earth is rotating, so different parts of the Earth are being irradiated by the sun throughout the day, creating a natural heating-cooling cycle. Certain sections of the atmosphere are being warmed more so than others at any given time, and when gases are heated, they expand. This creates pressure differentials. Pressure is the force exerted by the particles in a system, and the laws of thermodynamics dictate that particles will move from areas of higher pressure to lower pressure, which essentially just means that particles will spread out. So when hotter air expands and rises due to its decreased density, cooler, denser air will rush in to replace it. That's wind. Earth's atmosphere is an incredibly chaotic system with an unimaginable number of particles responding to a variety of energy inputs and obeying pressure differentials. Wind will speed up, then slow down due to friction as winds converge near low-pressure areas. It's rather complicated and very difficult to predict, though we've gotten better at it over the past few decades. Now, that was obviously highly simplified, and any professional meteorologist could spend an entire week expanding on what I just told you, but that's the gist of it. Now let's take those concepts and talk about hurricanes. How do they form? The principles are the same in the sense that it's just atmospheric particles obeying pressure differentials. Specifically, we are talking about warm, moist air over tropical waters at a temperature above 27 degrees Celsius, or about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, as a result of the evaporation of water in those hot areas. This hot and humid air will rapidly rise, creating a low-pressure area that is filled by surrounding cooler air. In the meanwhile, the hotter air that rose begins to cool and condense into clouds, releasing heat, which warms the surrounding air and reinforces the effect until a storm begins to form. The rotation of the Earth generates what is called the Coriolis effect, or Coriolis force, which causes a deflection in the path of atmospheric particles. The ramification of this is that a nascent storm will begin rotating, with the direction of rotation depending on whether the storm is in the northern or southern hemisphere. The magnitude of this Coriolis force is strongest right near the equator, which is why hurricanes only form in tropical zones between 5 and 20 degrees of latitude. These storms grow in intensity, particularly over open ocean, and once winds reach 74 miles per hour, it is referred to as a Category 1 hurricane. This scale, the Saffir-Simpson scale, goes up to Category 5, which would involve winds above 155 miles per hour, implying large-scale destruction to any civilized latitude. These storms grow in intensity. This is that a nascent storm will begin rotating until a storm begins to form. The rotation of the Earth generates what is called the Coriolis effect, or Coriolis force, which causes a deflection in the path of atmospheric particles. The ramification of this is that a nascent storm will begin rotating, with the direction of rotation depending on whether the storm is in the northern or southern hemisphere. The magnitude of this Coriolis force is strongest right near the equator, which is why hurricanes only form in tropical zones between 5 and 20 degrees of latitude. These storms grow in intensity, particularly over open ocean, and once winds reach 74 miles per hour, it is referred to as a Category 1 hurricane. This scale, the Saffir-Simpson scale, goes up to Category 5, which would involve winds above 155 miles per hour, implying large-scale destruction to any civilized area it touches. So let's review. Hurricanes form over warm tropical waters, and they form specifically because the water is warm, such that an appreciable amount of it evaporates, and that hot, humid air rises, generating pressure differentials and forming clouds, which create a storm. And being near the equator, the Coriolis force causes the storm to rotate. In a nutshell, that's what a hurricane is. To be clear, the word hurricane describes this phenomenon in the region of the Atlantic or Eastern Pacific Oceans. In other parts of the world, they are called cyclones or typhoons, but these are all different words describing the same phenomenon. So, now that we know what hurricanes are, the next logical question for our purposes here is, how in the hell would any government control this process? And without just blindly shouting lasers and leaving it at that, since we now know how hurricanes form. We are talking about hot, humid air over tropical bodies of water. Did the American government put a huge heater at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico? And of course, it's much harder to tackle than that. We aren't just talking about the generation of a hurricane, but the ability to control and direct it. Remember, we are describing quadrillions and quintillions of atmospheric particles simply obeying pressure differentials and exerting the power of tens of thousands of...
We did. And its tax document says its mission is to promote the rule of law and limited constitutional government. And it received $24 million from an anonymous donor in 2017.
I have a very simple rule, which is I'm engaged in the battle of ideas, and I care very deeply about our Constitution and the role of courts in our society. And I don't waste my time on stories that involve money and politics, because what I care about is ideas.
Oh, come on. I know this is so obvious it barely needs to be said, but where things come from does matter. For the same reason that Lunchables can't just list its ingredients as mind your fucking business. But even if it can be hard to say who all of Leo's backers are, it is clear what both he and they want. Judges on the bench who are against regulation and deeply socially conservative, although Leo will sometimes try and put a more moderate face on that. In the early days of Trump's term, Leo helped supply him with 25 names of potential Supreme Court nominees, and watch him shrug off questions about whether any of those names might one day impact the right to an abortion.
Is the fear on the left justified that this means that Roe v. Wade is in jeopardy if one of the 25 gets through the process?
The left has been using the Roe v. Wade scare tactic since 1982, when Sandra O'Connor was nominated. And over 30 years later, nothing's happened to Roe v. Wade. So I think the abortion issue is really very much a scare tactic.
As I think we all know, it played out a bit differently. Shortly afterward, Trump nominated Kavanaugh from Leo's list, and he, along with Gorsuch and Barrett, two other picks Leo recommended, wound up overturning Roe. So clearly, it wasn't just a scare tactic at all. It's honestly hard to imagine how that clip could have aged worse, other than if he continued, no one needs to prepare for any sort of novel coronavirus in the future, and don't worry about Armie Hammer's career, that thing's gonna keep going great. The point is, Leo's had a huge amount of success in planting hard-right judges throughout the federal court system, and that has enabled conservative groups, some of which he funds, to effectively go judge shopping. What that means is they're able to write a lawsuit designed to achieve a specific policy end, bring it before a district court judge who came up through the Federalist Society, appeal it up through circuit courts, increasingly stocked with Federalist Society alumni, and maybe even get it in front of the Supreme Court, a full third of whose members came off the list from the Federalist Society's own Leonard fucking Leo. He's putting out new conservative judges the way Apple puts out new TV shows, constantly and basically silently. And while testing the law through the courts is something both liberal and conservative groups have long used as a tactic, it's now much easier for conservatives to do it, even with incredibly weak cases. Take last year's fight over mifepristone, a drug used in most abortions. The lawsuit that precipitated that fight was clearly crafted to restrict abortion access. It began with activists creating a brand new group called the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which they incorporated in Amarillo, Texas, just months before it filed the lawsuit. And they chose Amarillo for a very specific reason.
By filing its lawsuit in Amarillo, the Alliance Defending Freedom was almost guaranteed to draw Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, a Trump appointee who worked in the conservative Christian legal movement.
Exactly. By filing in Amarillo, they knew their case was likely to get assigned to Kaczmarek, seen here shortly after asking his barber for the wet marine. That is the reason they and so many conservative groups are going to Amarillo. It's not for the historic tour of Route 66 or the canyon horseback ride or even the huge pair of legs, which are apparently number 30 on TripAdvisor's list of things to do in Amarillo, even though I've never seen a more obvious number 1 in my entire life. They have absolutely glowing reviews, such as, it's a huge pair of legs standing in a pasture next to the road. What a unique statue, tall legs out in a field. And I figured while here, why not go find them? They're interesting and big. And amen to that, brother, they sure are. Kaczmarek is incredibly conservative. He said being transgender is a delusion, has argued against contraception and same-sex marriage, and criticised the legal foundations of Roe v. Wade. So he was always likely to be incredibly sympathetic to the plaintiffs in the mifepristone case, which was lucky for them because their arguments were laughably weak. Basically, some of the plaintiffs were pro-life doctors who argued the FDA's approval of mifepristone, which has been used safely for over 20 years, should be withdrawn, in part because it could harm the doctors themselves. They argued that treating patients who'd suffered adverse health effects from the drug, which again, rarely happens, could cause them hardship and subject them to enormous stress and pressure. Though a few things about that. First, none of those doctors were required to prescribe the drugs or regularly treat abortion patients. They couldn't identify a single case where any of them had been forced to provide such care, and there's already a federal law that protects them from having to do so. Basically, their argument did not have a leg to stand on, which is a little ironic, considering Amarillo has 2 of them that are just fucking hanging around for some reason. But Kaczmarek sided with the plaintiffs anyway, striking down the FDA's approval of mifepristone. The government appealed his ruling, but it was then upheld by the notoriously conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where a third of the judges are Trump appointees. Now, the good news here is that the Supreme Court ultimately reversed the ruling, saying the plaintiffs lacked standing to sue because they hadn't convincingly proven that they were being harmed, because they fucking weren't. The bad news is, this was by no means a full-throated rejection. As in Kavanaugh's drafting of the opinion, he explicitly left the door open to try again in the future, saying that it is not clear that no one else would have standing to challenge the FDA's relaxed regulation of mifepristone. A hint so broad, it might as well have had a winking emoji at the end of it. The point is, the courts are now incredibly amenable to lawsuits that conservatives bring. And while the mifepristone and Trump immunity rulings have been pretty widely discussed, one of the biggest conservative victories this year has actually flown under the radar a bit, even though, for most of Leonard Leo's big corporate backers, it's probably the most important reason to support him, and it concerns regulation. Companies famously hate regulation, an attitude shared by certain members of the Supreme Court, especially Neil Gorsuch, who always looks like the man in every Cialis commercial. Gorsuch released a book this year called Overruled: The Human Toll of Too Much Law, about how, in his view, regulatory agencies are out of control and basically making up new laws left and right. For years now, he's delivered a spiel about how federal agencies, which fall under the executive branch, have usurped the power that rightly belongs to the legislative one. It's an argument he delivers with his trademark electric personality like this.
The executive branch has made up so many new criminal laws